Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar this evening. I'm Devin Miles with Heritage Ohio, and with great pleasure, I'm happy to introduce to you tonight Brandon Spencer Hartle of the Preservation League of Oregon. They have kindly agreed to partner with us tonight to present to you adaptive reuse of historic schools. It sounds like a great presentation tonight. I'm just as interested as all of you. Before we get started, I want to go over simple ground rules for tonight's presentation with all of you. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation tonight, but please feel free to send your questions along through the chat box at any time during the presentation that you have them. Also, if you experience any difficulties with the webinar platform tonight, the simplest solution is to log out and sign back in. That solves 99% of the problems people have with the webinar software. So if your sound starts digitalizing, starts getting muffled, starts skipping, anything like that, or you see your slides aren't progressing when you think they should be, just log back out and sign back in using that same link you received, and most of the problems will be solved that way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon in a second. Brandon, I made myself a presenter, so you're going to need to reshare your screen with everyone.
Sounds good, Devin.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay, I can see it. You're all set.
Great. So it's Peggy Moretti and myself here tonight, and I'm going to let Peggy Moretti give everyone a little bit of background as to where this presentation came from, who we are, and then we'll start to dig into the meat of the program. I've got the chat box open here, so if anybody has questions that pop up during the presentation, feel free to type those in, but otherwise I think most questions, holding them to the end, would be easiest for us, just so we can respond to things kind of in a logical fashion. So I'll turn it over to Peggy Moretti, Executive Director of the Historic Preservation League of Oregon, to get things started.
Hello there. It's afternoon for us, but I guess it's early evening for you all, and glad to share what we've been working on a little bit here in the Pacific Northwest. Just real quickly, the HPLO is a nonprofit, much like our friends in Ohio, and our mission is to preserve, reuse, and pass forward Oregon's historic resources because we think that's so important to have livable, sustainable communities. We are comprised of league organizations at the local level, individuals. We're a partner of the National Trust. We hold conservation easements, and we do a number of educational programs. We do advocacy on behalf of preservation, and try to be that voice of preservation and adaptive reuse across our state. I'm going to skip over some of the stuff we've been talking about, other than to make a mention that a conservation easement, we brought this into our original presentation, which, by the way, we delivered a couple of different times here in Oregon at different communities who were looking at similar situations as you all are, of a school building that they are trying to decide what they can do with that. A lot of folks are not aware of what a conservation easement does, and that is a tool that provides permanent contractual protection of a historic property as it is passed to subsequent owners over time. So I just shared that little bit of information for you to tuck away as one of the tools that might be beneficial if schools do end up transferring out of government ownership into private ownership, or if other historic properties are, courthouses, post offices, a lot of other things, as they if a community wants to make sure that those things remain standing in perpetuity, that a conservation easement is a mechanism for doing that. Something else we do out here is the Preservation Roundtable, and oops, there we go. We're still trying to figure out the webinar movement here. We've been tackling various topics that relate to preservation of historic districts and doing compatible infill, and this year we're spending a lot of time looking at historic masonry buildings, of which a lot of schools are unreinforced masonry buildings, and how we cost effectively rehabilitate them and also do the seismic upgrades, which are probably much more important here on the West Coast than it is back in the Midwest, but it is nonetheless an important topic. So that's a little background on us. Our schools program that we're showing here came out of our most endangered places list. Our organization, I don't know if Ohio does this, but our organization publishes an annual list of Oregon's most endangered places, and we do that to spotlight some of the most historic, the most important historic resources that are at risk from either just, you know, some neglect or the hard times or, you know, on any number of factors. And we try to bring together resources and solutions and develop plans for their preservation and reuse. Here on this slide you see a number of examples of those. One of our most endangered places in 2011 was a particular historic high school out in Baker City, Oregon. And as we tried to, there's a picture of it right there, as we tried to engage the community and brainstorm means of preserving it, this program is an outcome of that. In this particular case, Baker City Middle School is, as you can tell, architecturally very significant, and but it has been decommissioned, and it is sitting there vacant. And vacant is bad for historic buildings. They start to deteriorate like 4 times faster when they're vacant than when they are kept in use. So this program was put together as a means of just kind of helping the community understand what the possibilities are. Sometimes these things just kind of, you know, they're not what you deal with every day, and you just kind of don't know what's already been done out there, and we wanted to share some best practices and just help create a vision for what the possibilities are. So we haven't changed our presentation a great deal. When our friends in Ohio called, we just said, well, hey, we can share what we've got, and hopefully you'll find ways in which this sparks some parallels in your own community. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon, and he's going to walk through some of the examples that we researched and uncovered of what's working, what's going on out there. Brandon.
Sounds good. So one thing I wanted to give a little bit of background to, and I think this is probably pertinent for the situation in Ohio, is in Oregon we have a mix of different communities and different economic situations across the state. And Portland, the Portland area is urbanized and has a lot of activity and experience with adaptive reuse. But other parts of the state, like Baker City, where this high school is located, have seen stagnant or negative population growth, have maintained a small town feel, and also have a very limited tax base. So putting this program together, we tried to show a range of experiences that could be helpful in different sized communities with different situations as far as their local economics and their demographics and population change. But one of the things we always like to start with in our programs to bring everyone up to speed as to why historic schools matter from a preservation standpoint. And this is a little map of where we'll be going in the remainder of the presentation here tonight. But we like to talk a little bit about why historic schools matter. I think first and foremost, and you're all probably well aware of this, historic schools represent a substantial public investment. I think it's always important to make the argument that hard-earned community dollars went towards their design and craftsmanship. In most cases, and this is probably the case in Ohio, schools were designed by some of the most prominent architects in the state or the local community, and it was a conscious decision on the part of the community to use high-quality architecture to create a center of community life and to make them a true sense of place within the community. And I think it goes almost without saying to mention that with historic school buildings there are generations of memories and activities and graduates and experiences that are all embodied in the school's significance. And oftentimes when you talk to people about, you know, the historic places that impacted people when they were younger children, schools are some of the first things that pop up. So there really is a kind of embodied nostalgic significance in a lot of these historic school buildings. So we like to talk about historic preservation in terms of the triple bottom line of sustainability, in terms of economic development, environmental protection, and community sense of place. So what we know is that when you rehabilitate a building, 60% of expenses go towards labor cost, meaning more money stays within the community than goes overseas for materials. This is different than new construction, where the ratio is essentially reversed, where 40% of rehabilitation expenses go towards labor and 60% goes towards materials, which are often sourced from out of state or overseas. Dollar for dollar, we know that rehab has been shown to create more jobs than manufacturing or new construction. And if you're not familiar with the work of Donovan Ripkema and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, there are some great case studies from around the country showing that rehab really is an economic development engine. Along those lines, 75% of the economic benefit generated by rehab stays within the local economy. And I think this is a significant argument for preservation of schools, of courthouses, of private residential buildings. Especially today, it's important for us to truly talk about the economic development component of preservation. In Oregon, and I can't speak to Ohio tonight, we know that 28% of our state's overnight tourists are specifically seeking out historic buildings and places. And in Oregon, our tourism economy is a $7 billion a year industry. So we know that over a quarter of people who are coming here and spending their money and staying in small hotels and around the state are seeking out these historic places. And we'll show you a couple of examples of schools in a few minutes here that are tourist draws in and of themselves. So we think that's a pretty important factor to consider. So maybe we'll talk for a few minutes here about the environmental benefits of preservation. We know that owners of buildings built before 1930 spend 27% less on their utility bill because of the inherent energy efficiencies built into the buildings. In our older schools, we see operable windows, we see a maximization of light, we see wide hallways, and we see a quality of materials used that they really were energy efficient. And even though a number of mechanical changes and upgrades have happened to a lot of schools over the years, with rehabilitation, you can maximize the embodied energy and make them energy efficient. We know that rehabilitation and reuse maximizes existing infrastructure, meaning less materials go to the landfill, and meaning that you can take advantage of the existing utilities and urban infrastructure, meaning in the long term, it costs less for government and the community to pay for their upkeep than new construction. And I'm going to use a Portland example here, but also refer everyone to take a look at a new National Trust report that may have some good relevance for the work you're all doing. But we know in Portland, it takes 16 years to recoup the impacts related to the construction of a replacement school. So one of the arguments we make is rather than to get into a vicious, wasteful cycle of replacement, investing in our existing schools is the smart thing to do for the environment. And at the bottom, I sourced this from a new National Trust report that you can find online. If you do a Google search for National Trust for Historic Preservation and Green Building Laboratory, you'll find a report that came out, I think, about 2 months ago that specifically talks to historic school reuse and its environmental benefits. And the last leg of the triple bottom line of sustainability that I'd like to mention is the social and cultural aspects of rehabilitating and retaining schools. We know that historic places are the landmarks of communities. Historic places can be incubators for creative tenants and bellwethers of walkable neighborhoods. We know that our historic schools are built in places where kids could walk to school, that teachers could ride a bike. And we also know that when adaptively reused for new purposes, historic schools and just historic buildings in general can house creative tenants, can house new industries. And another point I'd like to make here, and this again can be found from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but we know that the neighborhoods surrounding schools fare better in recessions than neighborhoods outside of schools in terms of property values. That it's been demonstrated that property values adjacent to historic school buildings are are higher and they have more stability than those that are further from schools, because communities know these buildings are a center point for life in the neighborhood. So the approach we took in our presentations here in Oregon is taking a look at 3 different ways of reusing historic school buildings. We'll talk about rehabilitating schools for continued school use. We'll talk about the transfer of schools for civic use, and we'll talk about the sale of schools for new uses. And I think each of these 3 strategies is always worth looking at and investigating in terms of what the needs of the immediate neighborhood is, what the needs of the community is, how the tax base is structured. When we presented this in Baker City, we know that that community doesn't have the demographic need for a K through 12 school in their historic building. But we do know that they need a new community college campus, that they could use additional residential units downtown, and that they could use more creative office space. So knowing what your community needs really starts to help pinpoint what a historic school should be used for in the future. On the right side of the screen here, I've shown an example in Seattle, which is a very diverse and changing population center. But this is a historically African-American school in an inner residential neighborhood of Seattle that was adaptively reused as a museum, as affordable housing, and as education space. And as you can see in the photo at the top left, the building had been vacant actually for about 20 years before finally being rehabilitated in a public-private partnership. So the 3 examples I'd like to use as schools retained for school use are all located in Seattle, the Seattle area. And they've taken a very strategic look at rehabilitating their older and historic school buildings on a one-by-one approach for energy efficiency, for seismic safety, and to create greater flexibility on the interiors of the school to respond to new technology and new necessities among the students. The first example I'd like to look at is Franklin High School, which you can see at the top of the page here. Franklin High School is a 1911 building that was absolutely crumbling in the 1980s. The school district decided that demolition was the preferred alternative and actually went as far as taking out a demolition permit on the building. But the surrounding community rose up and demanded a preservation plan. They enlisted the support of the City Council and the Landmarks Preservation Board and actually the graduates of the school to come up with a plan for reusing and rehabilitating the school. And this was in the 1980s when this hadn't been done in Seattle before. They've been reusing schools for a long time. A lot of them were in need of work. But this was the first example of a major rehabilitation at the will of the community. And you can find more information on this school and actually all 3 of these online. But they're great examples of just having a community rise up and say, even though the school district might think this building is too far gone, it's not, and we can rehabilitate it. So in the early 1990s, they completed a rehabilitation that would allow the building to withstand a significant earthquake, that created flexible classroom spaces on the interior, but maintained the integrity of the exterior building exactly as it was when it was built in 1911. The next school building is the one in the middle. This is Roosevelt High School in a kind of outer ring historic neighborhood of Seattle. Roosevelt High School is a 1921 building, and in the late 1990s it was suffering the same fate as Franklin High School was suffering. It was crumbling. Many on the school board decided that it was too far gone, that they needed to build a new school. But again, the community rose up, and the community essentially said, we understand that needs have changed with this school building, but we can use the historic facade and meet all of those 21st century needs. So in 2006, a project was completed that included a compatible addition on the rear facade, which you can't see here, to incorporate additional learning space, as well as some significant interior changes to allow for computer labs, for new technology, for everything that students in the 21st century would need. But they kept the exterior of the building looking exactly like it was in 1921, and finish out a project that wasn't in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, it's worth taking a look at the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation as a baseline for what the National Park Service has determined good preservation work looks like. And we'll mention this again in a few minutes, but those standards are what are used to determine the eligibility for private tax credits if you explore an adaptive reuse situation. And all three of these examples followed those Secretary standards, even though they remained in school use. So that's a good baseline set of standards to use when talking about changes to your historic school building. So the last example is at the bottom of the screen here. And I think a lot of people in the Pacific Northwest just know this building, but for those of you outside of the Pacific Northwest, this was the high school in 10 Things I Hate About You. So it's been on TV, and I think the school district around the time that it was in that film recognized that this was a very significant building that needed a lot of work. It's an 1890s building, and the Tacoma School District decided to voluntarily move forward with a rehabilitation of the school. This is another great example where they were able to add an addition to the building to include underground parking and additional classroom space while meeting the Secretary standards for doing a complete exterior rehabilitation and changing out some of the interior spaces to make them more flexible. So I think what we want to mention here is basically the bottom line for our experience here in the Northwest is that we know that schools can be modernized, they can be seismically strengthened, and they can be rehabilitated to be passed forward for future generations of students while being green, being environmentally friendly. The project at the bottom has been LEED certified for environmental efficiency, and we know it can be done. And we know it can be done with the support of the community, and we know that even if the school board or policymakers go into a project not supporting it or not understanding the full benefits of preservation, that the loud voice of the community paired with data and facts about rehabilitation can sway policymakers' decisions. The other thing we know is that rehabilitation often costs less than demolition and new construction, especially when you consider existing infrastructures and the energy efficiencies inherent in older buildings. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of examples here in the Northwest of schools that have been reused for civic uses. K through 12 buildings that are now used for city halls, community colleges, libraries, and a host of other government-supported uses or community-supported uses in areas where demographics may have changed or new schools may have been built. So one example that we absolutely love here at the Historic Preservation League of Oregon is the Washington School in the city of Oakland. Oakland is a town in southern Oregon that has about a 5,000 person population. It's a very small community adjacent to a number of other small communities. And in the 1980s, the community made the decision to build a new school on the outskirts of town to service a number of surrounding small towns and main streets. And when that happened, this building you see on the left was vacated with no plan for the future. So in the early 1990s, the community of Oakland got together and applied for a grant from the USDA to study rehabilitation options for this 1910 school building. It took them 10 years to find all of the grants and donations. They held bake sales. They did all of your typical things to raise money for rehabilitating the school. And what they did with it is they turned it into their city hall and library, using all of the existing spaces for the mayor's office, for community meeting rooms, for a host of other community-supported functions that really fit well in the school. And they were able to undertake it with, like I said, about 10 years of grants and local fundraising and community support. And it's been just about 10 years since the project was completed, and it looks great today. And we use it for some of our programs that happen in that part of the state. And I think it's just a great example of a community that took the long view and worked hard and came up with a great reuse of their building.
I would point out it doesn't need to take 10 years. It just happened to do so in this community, but it's a very big success.
And I think I'll second Peggy's point. This community that Oakland is located in is historically was a timber community, and they started to fall on harder times in the 1990s when revenue from timber started to dry up. So they didn't have the tax base and the industry base that they used to. So it took them a while, but I think it's still a good example. And we can provide some more data on most of these projects if there's one that really stands out that you'd like to learn more about. The project on the right is my notes right here, a 1909 high school that was closed in the 1950s when a larger, more suburban high school was built. It's on the Oregon coast in the community of Astoria. And when this high school was closed in 1957, the community decided to use it for a community college. And as that community college grew during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it quickly outgrew this building and needed new buildings built around it. So about 5 years ago, the community came up with a plan to rehabilitate and modernize this building for continued use as a community college, but to really bring it into the 21st century. So in 2010, the community of Astoria completed a $27 million campus retrofit. And for those of you not familiar with Oregon, Astoria is in a high-risk zone for earthquake. So a lot of that cost went towards seismic upgrade. But today it's a fantastic example of a high school that functions wonderfully as a community college. And as you can see in the rendering at the bottom right, there are a number of existing and proposed new outbuildings that surround this historic high school. But the community's made a conscious effort of keeping it, reusing it in school use. And
so it really anchors the campus for the community college.
It does. And one of the things that's very, very cool about this project is it's got, you can't see it in any of the photos, but they were able to put solar panels on the roofs of all the buildings. You can't see them from the street. You can't see them from the exterior. But they were able to make a significant investment in green infrastructure at the site. So one of the properties we've been working with over the last year here, and at our program we heard a little bit more about, is the Springdale School in Corbett, Oregon, which is a small town east of Portland. And this school building had been vacant since about 1995. And the community's come together with donations, with low-interest loans from the school district, and with a host of grants to turn Springdale School into a community center with occasional classes in the afternoons, after-school programs, and been able to find a really good community use for this school. I don't want to talk too much about it, but if you do a Google search for Springdale School, you'll be able to turn up some of their more recent feasibility studies and plans for this building. And it may be a good example of taking a school that the community outgrew and doing something community-based with it. So now I want to talk a little bit about schools as new uses. And this is something that I think of all of the three examples we've been working a little bit closer with based upon some of, as I said, the changing demographics in communities, and communities like Baker City and Portland where maybe we don't need all of the school space to continue as school space, or we already have a city hall and the library and a community college that are functioning. And where we have to take a look at reusing these school buildings as something new. So I'm going to jump back up to Seattle and take a look at Wallingford Center, because I think it gives us a couple of really good out of the box ideas about how we can reuse school buildings for something new. So Wallingford School was built in 1904 and closed in the 1970s. And because it was publicly owned, the community made a strategic decision to designate the property in the National Register of Historic Places. And in Seattle, there are a number of regulatory protections for National Register properties. And I think the community just wanted to make sure that this building got the respect and the designated significance that it deserved. And the school district didn't oppose the nomination to the National Register. and it was listed, I think, in 1979. In the 1980s, the school district finally recognized that this wasn't going to be used as a school again anytime soon, and they put out an RFP for a 99-year lease of the building. And in Seattle, with this example and a couple others that we've looked into, they preferred the long-term lease over a sale of the building. And this is because in Seattle, they're not sure what 50 or 100 years from now might bring, and they want to make sure that these buildings can be converted back into school use if that ever demographics change and that becomes a priority. I don't know that that's the best way to go about rehabilitating a school, but it's certainly one option that's out there and has been used extensively in Seattle. And today, and actually since 1986, this building has been used for ground floor retail and 24 apartments upstairs. And it's a really it's a good example of a proposed reuse that doesn't just have a one-size-fits-all approach for the building, that they were able to think strategically about their 99-year lease and make changes as time has gone on. They've reduced the amount of retail available in the building as the housing market has taken off, and they've made changes to the building as time has gone on. Because one of the things that we've noticed with a lot of schools around Oregon is they've changed uses over time. They changed from an elementary school to a middle school, and even with an adaptive reuse situation, you may change from offices to apartments. So I think recognizing that these buildings can be flexible and can change over the long term kind of helps chart the course for what the future brings. And a good example of this is Linton School in Eugene. It's a 1924 elementary school that was then changed to a middle school in the 1950s. And like the example we just demonstrated in Seattle, this is a property that was listed in the National Register of Historic Places to not just ensure protection. Eugene doesn't have any demolition denial ordinance, and they couldn't stop the demolition of it. But having it listed in the National Register really does give the community a sense of its importance and its significance, and gives the opportunity for a developer to access tax credits and other special financing situations only available to designated historic properties. So in the early 1990s, this school, the demographics changed. A new school was built, and it was determined that this school would never be used for school use again. So the community was sold to a developer through a RFP process. There was a lot of community input, a number of conversations about what community uses could fit in the school, what private uses are needed in the communities. And it was determined that the best use for this building for both the developer and the surrounding neighborhood was 59 apartments with a community garden and a small amount of community meeting space. But what's interesting here is about 5 years ago, this school was converted to condominiums. So again, showing over time how these spaces adapt and change, here from a elementary school to a middle school, then to apartments, and now the condominiums. And this is a good example of a reused school building that just fits seamlessly within a residential neighborhood. So one more example here out of the Portland area is the Linton School, which is one of the community's smallest historic schools. And it's on the edge of town in a very working class neighborhood. It was built in 1929 and closed in the 70s. And in the late 1980s, our major newspaper here, the Oregonian, publicized its sale in the real estate listings. And it's my understanding that one developer responded to that, purchased the building in 1989, and converted it to 11 condominium units. And again, this is a great example of a school that is centered in a residential neighborhood, a working residential neighborhood, and the conversion to condominiums fits seamlessly with its uses in the neighborhood. It's something that if this building was turned into a library or turned into a community center, it would have meant a lot of traffic for a small neighborhood. It would have meant a lot of change. So getting that reuse right and understanding the needs of the neighborhood and the feel of the neighborhood, I think was a good example of how this school fit into things. And today, actually, most of the original buyers of the condominium units still live there and are stakeholders in that community. So those are the examples we wanted to give, just to kind of get the juices flowing on thinking about some of the examples we've seen here in the Pacific Northwest, some of the things we've looked at as good examples of rehabilitation that meets the Secretary of the Interior standards, of a range of sale and use and lease options. But we wanted to close our presentation with some basically best practices that we've seen in the Northwest. And after we go through these best practices, I think that'll be a good time to start to respond to questions and engage in a little bit of a dialogue about maybe some of the things we might be able to share with you from our experience here in Oregon. So listing the property in the National Register of Historic Places can provide recognition, documentation, and protection in some cases for historic school buildings. Any property that's in public ownership can be nominated to the National Register, even against owner consent, though in most cases it seems like we've seen schools that were listed in the National Register and the school district neither really supported or opposed that decision, mostly because in Oregon we don't have many communities with strict demolition denial or demolition review ordinances. So designating it in the National Register does allow future owners to take advantage of tax credits and financing mechanisms, but also really does give it the documentation it deserves, the recognition it deserves, and can really provide a good baseline to understanding this school is historically significant. Ultimately, we've found that it's best to keep historic school buildings in use as schools. It's difficult to reuse them for condominiums or offices or artist spaces, and keeping a building as a school, keeping it in the original function that it was intended for, is always the best thing to do. And we see this in the Secretary of the Interior standards, where one of the National Park Service's standards is to find a use that's compatible with the building. Education uses are compatible with these historic school buildings. We've also found that it's important to, if you do decide to, if your community and school district decides that a school building will never be used as a school again, or there's no public use that goes into it, it's important to get it back on the property tax rolls, get it back in use. As Peggy mentioned earlier, many studies have shown that a vacant building ages 5 times faster than an occupied building. The systems are shut off. There's wear and tear. There may be vandalism. So keeping the building in use is really a priority. In Oregon, we have, and I'm not sure if Ohio has this or not, but we have a property tax limitation measure that essentially, if in Oregon schools are largely funded by property taxes, and with our property tax limitation, the amount of revenue coming in is only 3% greater every year than the year before. So for school districts, putting a property back on the property tax rolls helps them educate students, helps them do their jobs by bringing in needed revenue through a space that, if no longer used by government, should be transitioned to the public hands so that it's occupied and continued to be used. So some more best practices are to engage the preservation community. It's always important to get together, to meet, to talk, to really support a preservation plan that is financially viable, economically feasible, and responds to community values. One of the things that we've shown with our Preservation Roundtable series is that getting all the stakeholders together around the table to draw a common vision of what they want for rehabilitation can provide that critical mass of support that's needed to move something forward. And finally, and this is more targeted towards maybe the owner of the property, but it's important to find a realistic sale price. We've been working with a couple of properties and we've researched a number of past experiences here in the Portland area where the Portland Public Schools has been unwilling to sell a property for its true value. And in many cases, school districts have looked towards the highest and best use of a school property in finding a sale price. But we think it's always important to remind school districts and remind the community that these were buildings that were built using public dollars, using a known architect, and using high quality materials. And it should be a priority to pass them forward rather than looking for the highest sale price on a piece of property.
Well, and just to point out something about the economics of redeveloping a historic school building, it's expensive, and often we've spoken with several of developers in our state who specialize in redeveloping historic properties, and one of the things that will make or break their pro forma is the sale price of the property itself. If they can buy that building at a low enough rate, they can make the case for investing in the rehabilitation costs. If they don't get that building at a fairly low cost, then they aren't able to make their numbers pencil out. So I know one of the school districts we've talked to has basically agreed that they'll sell the building for $1 because they'd rather see the thing kept standing and converted into a new use, and then the taxes generated off of the property than to let it sit there and try to milk the sale price. So I just throw that out there, as I know it's sometimes hard for school districts to decide really what kind of a strategy they're going to take on that, but trying to get super top dollar out of selling an old building is probably not going to be an effective way to go. You won't find a buyer. And I want to say something else too. The other temptation is just to demolish it and just to end up with this empty piece of land. I mean, of course, we see that happen everywhere, but this is where we try to encourage communities to consider what serves that community. There's a lot of especially in the older, I don't want, areas of the Midwest and in certain areas of Oregon as well, communities had decided when something got old they were just going to tear it down because they thought the old building didn't look very good, or they were worried that they might have a little liability or something like that from keeping the building standing. But then what you end up with is a whole bunch of vacant, ugly, kind of naked spots all through your community, which just kind of adds to this overall picture of blight. And we would just really want to urge a community to avoid the temptation to just say, we're just going to tear it down, and seriously consider sell it cheap instead. Find a developer who is willing to put the money into it, who has some vision for what this thing could be. It's going to serve the community much, much better to have that building reused than to have yet another empty lot.
So that's what we wanted to present to you. When we've done this presentation around the state, oftentimes we've done a panel discussion following with people, representatives of the school district, architects that have worked on historic school buildings, community advocates that have done it before, and we're not going to do that tonight, but for our purposes, we found it pretty valuable to try to get all the perspectives that are out there represented. Because I think a lot of times when you do engage in this conversation about the economic value, the community value, the environmental value of rehabilitating school buildings, it's hard to deny that rehabilitation makes the most sense when you're looking long-term for your community. And of course, you could create a couple of jobs for a few days demolishing a historic school building, but that's not taking the long-term approach that we all know is necessary for economic development and community revitalization. Reusing and rehabilitating and adapting historic school buildings is taking the 5, 10, 50-year view of what you want your community to be. And I think that's hard to deny when you...
And maintaining that sense of place, that sense of who you are. And the schools we're finding are just, they're a real key component in a neighborhood's or a district's definition of their identity. And so many things kind of link back into that school property that when they go away, they leave a really big gaping hole. So that's our little plug for hanging on to those things. I guess it'd be time to ask for questions.
Yeah, if you want to type in a question to the chat box, that's the place to do it, and we will do our best to respond to them. And Devin, feel free to take over whenever you like.
Sure. Thank you, guys. This was a great presentation. I just wanted to make a couple comments that were mentioned, pertaining to Ohio during the presentation. Our school tax structure is similar but a little bit different than Oregon's. In Ohio, ours is funded through property tax, as all of you Ohioans know, and it's also unconstitutional in Ohio for over the past decade. But no new solutions have been made in Ohio, so we're kind of stuck with the system currently as is, but we do not have any limitations. More familiar to most of you in Ohio, we have bond issues. So that's primarily how the two main funding sources in Ohio schools are being funded. So we don't have those luxuries that Oregon does for saving these schools. Also, at the beginning, Oregon mentioned their most endangered properties. Ohio has a similar program called Top Opportunities in Ohio. And for the 2012 year, you have another few more weeks to get your submissions in. So for all of you Ohioans that have a building in your community that you think is important to your community's livelihood and the nature of your community, you have until March 30th to make submissions for that program and that building. You can find more of that on our website, which is www.heritageohio.org. And it's under our programs, and you'll find it as Top Opportunities. And you can find the submission form and all the rules and who you can contact in our office about it. And we'll give you guys a few more minutes to type in any questions you have. And just once again, I wanted to thank Peggy and Brandon both for doing this exceptional presentation tonight. It's one of our first transcontinental presentations, so It's been a great success. I see we have a question coming in, so I'll read the question. You guys can answer it. Renee has a question. Do you have any suggestions for mothballing or securing buildings while the reuse is being discussed?
Well,
don't turn off the heat.
Yeah. and that's one of the things that we've been concerned about out in Baker City is when that school was vacated, they shut the doors, they turned off the utilities, and they left it. In Portland, with a vacant school that we've been working with, windows have been boarded, everything has been enclosed, and that's encouraged graffiti, and that's encouraged kind of activities on the site that we don't want to see. I think that's probably a tough question depending on what's going on in the neighborhood. I would say as soon as the graffiti and broken windows show up, it kind of follows that broken windows theory that once one window is broken, then all the rest are going to get broken out. So I think that if there can be a little strategic plan on part of the neighbors and the school board to do any necessary exterior repairs if vandalism happens or if any problems come up, to make sure that you don't have a building that slides down that slippery slope. If graffiti happens, to be able to abate that, or if a window pane gets broken out with a rock, fix that before the next kid throws a rock through the next window, and on and on. But I don't know if there's any. I don't think we have any good concrete, examples as to where that's been addressed.
Thank you, guys. Give you guys a few more seconds to type in any final questions you have.
Well, and maybe I'll just mention too. You can if any of these examples you want more information on, you're welcome to send us an email, and I'll give you our email address, my email address, if you want a link or more documentation on any of these or would like to continue the conversation. Or if you ever find your way out to the Portland area and want us to give you first-hand information, you can send me an email at Brandon, B-R-A-N-D-O-N, at historicpreservationleague.org.
Thank you, Brandon.
And I would just like to say that the takeaway is that these buildings are in fact being very successfully reused, whether as schools or out in more of a private commercial use. It is happening out there. It is possible. And sometimes it seems so daunting that, or overwhelming, that you don't know where to start. But if there's one thing I just want to somehow convey is, yeah, it is so very possible. But, that redevelopment is not going to be happening by the school district themselves unless they intend to keep it as a school. And so I think one sort of was embedded in our best practices here, but if it's never going to be a school again, sell it. Don't, get it in the hands of somebody who knows what to do with it. And there are, in every quadrant of our country, there are developers who specialize in historic properties and know how to handle them. And if you're talking with developers or you're considering your strategy, make sure that you do qualify those folks, that they have a portfolio of successful rehabilitations of historic buildings, and because it's a different species of development than completely new construction. But there are people who are doing it, they're actually making money at it, and the communities where they are doing their work are being very, very blessed by it. So it's possible.
And I'm going to respond quickly here to Deborah's question. Deborah asked if pro formas are available for projects presented, and I don't have any of the pro formas on hand, but who I would talk to is the development company Lorig, L-O-R-I-G Development. They're based out of Seattle, and they've done probably a dozen school reuse projects across the West, and they've been great in sharing information with us, and they may be willing to give you some of the stripped down information or talk with you about some of the general findings. As far as floor plans and kind of redesign drawings go, you might want to talk to Bassetti Architects, B-A-S-S-E-T-T-I, and they've got multiple offices out here in the West, and again have been an architect of choice for many of the public school districts that have done rehabs. And I'm sure they would be more than happy to send you that information. So again, Bassetti Architects and Lorig Development is who I would suggest getting that level of detail from.
And Renee and Steve both had questions on funding. And Steve is asking, particularly about the Oakland City Hall adaptive reuse. He's saying that it's a good adaptive reuse idea for many small towns in Ohio. And just if you could discuss, if you know anything about the funding of those projects.
I can, and what the Oakland City Hall, they actually received about a quarter of their rehab costs from the USDA's Rural Development Initiative, and that's what really got them started on the road towards rehabilitation. They were able to use that money to hire out an architect and do their feasibility study and get them the necessary documentation to go after grants. They also received some funding from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The National Trust doesn't offer as much funding nowadays, but they were able to get some pretty significant funding there. And they were able to just go after all of the regional foundations one by one and apply for money. And I'm trying to think if I know of any other sources. I know that USDA Rural Development Initiative piece was instrumental for them.
Another way to look at it is if the property is like the sale of the property and thinking of leasing it back. If a private developer takes that on, then he qualifies, or she qualifies for federal tax credits up to 20% and some other things. And then if they know they have a guaranteed tenant, they can go out and get their bank financing and other things too. So sometimes the city is better served by not being their own landlord and just renting it back from somebody else who's taking care of all of that. So you might think about that too.
There's a question here about strategies for smaller communities, and maybe smaller. There's a range of smaller. One of the examples that we didn't show that I personally love is in Bend, Oregon, which is in the central part of the state. And I don't know, Bend probably has a population of 60 to 80,000, so that's not small. But I think this is something that may be of consideration for real small communities. They turned their former Catholic high school, a one-story building, into a hotel and brew pub, and that was done by the McMiniman brothers. But today it's one of the places to stay in town just because they were able to take the classroom spaces and split them in half and turn them into bedrooms as part of their hotel. And they've actually done this with another project in Oregon, the Kennedy School, And again, a one-story school building that they kept the existing floor plan. It's a double-loaded corridor with classrooms on both sides, and turned that into a hotel. But again, I think it was a strategic thinking about, well, what does our community need? And in those cases, a hotel in those neighborhoods popped up as being something that, you know, they could use. We've seen around the state a number of the more one-room kind of wood frame schoolhouses be used for arts centers, or again, kind of the community center idea. But again, I think it really depends on what your specific community needs and what kind of.
And sometimes there's multiple uses going on in the schools. There might be, I think one of the examples showed there was retail on the ground floor, there were apartments or condos, and then the old auditorium could become an arts venue, or, you know, community theater or something like that. So I think in terms of multiple uses.
It's great suggestions, guys. Jeff has a question on what is the best way to encourage a school board to consider keeping the building in, I'm assuming, intact, and not demolishing it and trying to sell only the land.
And Peggy probably has some good points. I think the first thing that jumps to mind for me is to essentially you first get the community together, try to get a robust group of supporters, people who understand it, but then make the economic argument, make the long-term economic argument that the school district would be best served by reusing this building, putting it in private tax rolls, and having future generations using a building and, you know, supporting property tax, supporting income tax, being, you know, engaging that infrastructure and just saying, take the long-term view of what the next 30 to 50 years is going to mean and how you're going to fund educating students, which is your mission. But how do you use the building, or how do you allow for the building to be used so it's an economic model for the future?
Well, and I'm sure part of their argument, they'll build something new on the building and that'll generate taxes or whatever, but we see an awful lot of those properties just sit empty for years. And I always like to say, don't tear down a historic building if you don't have a guarantee of exactly what's going to go in there and replace it, because you end up with those blighted, empty lots all the time, and trash and weeds and other kinds of stuff growing. But I think really it's about the community. I mean, the school board is an elected body, and if they get a clear message from the community and you're organized and you say, no, wait a minute, this has value, this has meaning to us, and we really demand that other options be explored, they'll listen. And, you know, it requires organization, it requires communication, it probably involves, you know, op-ed pieces in the local newspaper, websites, you know, find some people that understand a little bit about throwing together a web page, a Facebook group, writing letters to the editor. Just get out there, and I think sometimes it's just about refusing to surrender.
And I think Peggy makes a good point. I think getting people together around the table and getting people on board with the idea from the private sector, the public sector, the community, the neighborhood, to get a unified voice that understands that rehabilitation creates more jobs than new construction, that reusing these buildings is good for the environment, that you can market a reused school building to people around the country who might come and visit your town, to get that unified voice from the chamber and from the construction industry, and to come up with the right vision for the building. You know, you make a very compelling argument.
And assuming that right now empty land is not just flying out the door in terms of sales. I mean, if there's this huge market demand right now for empty lots to build on in your neighborhood, you know, that argument might have some merit that, well, we should just sell the empty land. But I'm suspecting that's not the case, and in which case there's just no need to add yet another piece of empty land when you have an asset. It's an asset that's sitting on that land right now.
Those are some excellent points, guys. We have two final questions here. One is, a community has an older school and it's going to be vacated in 2 years, and these citizens are looking for ways to save this building, and they want to know if there are any missteps that you guys can think of that are commonly made in the process that a lot of people try, and they want to know how to avoid those missteps.
Well, I think one thing I'll say, and again, I apologize for not knowing how this would work in Ohio, but if the school district is receptive to donating a conservation easement, if you can get that level of receptivity, then you know you will have a perpetual protection on the building. So as part of the sale or transfer of the school, if that can be brought into the mix, if they're willing to have that conversation, that's something to consider pushing for. I think if you know 2 years in advance that it for sure will be vacated, that there's no opportunity of keeping the school in there, get started now, because 2 years will go by fast, and the stronger of a plan, the larger of a coalition you put together, the more likely it's going to be that building will be reused.
I think it's really helpful too if whatever coalition or let's just say this is Evergreen School, whatever the name of the school is, and you start your Friends of Evergreen School group. And on your Friends of group, it'd be great if you pulled together a good spectrum of expertise from the people who know how to communicate and use social media and write good op-eds to maybe some folks who will have experience in development or legal land use types of things, and then start developing strategies for the reuse of the buildings so that school boards are, they're dealing with a lot of stuff, as we know, and it's got to be a really thankless job to serve on a school board. My heart goes out to everybody who's in that position because of the pressures. So the more that the community group that want to see this thing stay standing and in use can come forth with at least a good skeleton of some solutions and recommendations, and do some of the don't just be oppositionists, but be constructive solution presenters. That'll help. I think that some of the mistakes people get into is when things degenerate into this really kind of ugly, personal, us versus them, confrontational tone, instead of saying, oh, we're neighbors. Let's see if we can't uncover a win-win answer.
I'm going to jump in here and Steve asked the question. I think there might be another one before his, but he asked if there's any any ideas for private schools that want to continue use of the school but face tight fiscal budgets. And I'm going to respond to this first with maybe a complicated answer that may or may not be appropriate, but that we've seen used a couple of times around this state. So I'm a graduate of the University of Oregon, which has an extension campus in Portland, and their campus in Portland was actually redeveloped by a private developer who was able to access historic preservation tax credits, new market tax credits, a special property tax freeze that we have here in Oregon.
Urban renewal money.
Urban renewal money. Was able to access all the financing mechanisms that maybe aren't available to nonprofit or public entities, and created an ownership structure that allowed for the school to go into this private redevelopment building with an option to buy at the end of the 5-year window required by the tax credits. So that may or may not be an answer for you, but there are some examples out there of things made more financial sense to allow a private developer to do the rehab and then lease the property back to the school with very strict conditions. It's something to look into. It may be a wise idea, if that makes some sense for your community, to talk with the National Trust's, the Community Investment Corporation, who work with tax credits and who work with complex ownership structures. But that's an option that's out there, is that public-private partnership that can access all of the available funds and meet all your needs.
Thank you. One final question is from the community of Ashtabula in Ohio. I'm going to combine some of your questions together and kind of extrapolate on them, so if they're not read verbatim, you know why. It's a two-parter question, focusing on, first, with developers, what kind of funding do you have available, or do you see available for developers, and how the community can help those developers achieve that funding? And the second part is also in regard to grants like the USDA rural grants. What first steps should a community like actually be able to take that really hasn't had that much experience with those grants in the past? And how do you think they should start progressing to get those for their community?
Well, I think that the first thing I'll say is just to reiterate that the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit is a 20% tax credit on the costs of rehabilitating a National Register listed building in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior standards. There's also another rehabilitation tax credit that's a 10% credit on the costs of rehab for properties that are not listed in the National Register but built before 1936. So there's quite a bit of information online about that credit, and in Oregon we've seen that being basically the lowest hanging fruit for tax credits. But there are also new market tax credits that are eligible for use in low-income areas, low-income census tracts. And there are affordable housing tax credits that are you're able to access if you're putting in housing. I think it's less than 60% of the median family income in your community.
I think that the point is, I'm not sure that the community or the school district really needs to be the ones that figure out all of that. It's who's going to be the developer. And if you're talking to a developer who doesn't know anything about that, you've got the wrong developer. So I'm sure, even though Ashtabula is a small community, I'm sure it's not that far removed from a more major city that might have some of those developers that are used to doing the historic projects. I'd start getting in touch with them. But probably there's two things I would suggest. Assuming the school is relatively intact in terms of its historic fabric, get it listed on the National Register, because that's a first step that is going to, without that, you don't get those tax credits. And without that, sometimes you don't get other grants too. That's sort of like a threshold you need to have in place before other things are accessible. And because it's a public property, and you can list it without, going through a bunch of hoops on owner consent. And then I would just suggest that there be some sort of a general plan or a vision for what the community thinks it needs, or how that property might be used. And then if there's a willingness on the part of the school district to sell that property cheap, then you can put out feelers to the developers and to other folks, and just see what kind of interest percolates up. I don't think the school district or the Friends of group has to sort out all that and build the whole financial pro forma or all of that. I just think they need to kind of line up the players and just kind of qualify that there is some consensus or willingness to go a certain direction. Does that make sense?
And I'm going to follow up with what Peggy said quickly and just say that the tax credit process, there are people who make their living navigating the tax credit universe for historic tax credits. I think what's important is getting a sense as to what all is out there and what percentages are offered, to remind people that there are tools available for this, to know, just have it written down and know that these are the types of tools, or these are the specific tools that are out there, just so you're aware if you interview a developer, or if the school district asks the question of, well, how can this get funded, or are there funding streams out there? And you can find this information on the internet through case studies, and if you do a search for rehabilitation tax credit, you'll find a list of the specifics for that program, but also other programs. I think, again, just to reiterate something Peggy said, and this is a tough one for us because we're from the big city of Portland here in Oregon. It's tough when you've got a small community that maybe doesn't have anyone who's a developer or an architect or a contractor that has any experience working on a historic building, and a lot of times you may have to look out of your community for the right people to facilitate the process of rehabilitating the building. And again, making the argument for local jobs and local labor is imperative. But again, if you don't have the right people in your community, you're going to have to look to Columbus or Cleveland or Chicago if there's somebody who can facilitate this process as a developer, if there's someone who understands tax credits. You have to think a little bit strategically about the bigger vision, and sometimes that might mean bringing somebody in from the outside. And
they can still hire local labor.
They can hire local labor, that they can create businesses that are going to stay locally, but the goal is to get the building rehabbed, and I think that you've got to take the big vision of that. And we see a lot of times in Oregon, small towns don't want to hire labor out of Seattle or Portland, don't want to see a developer come in from outside, but sometimes that's going to mean the difference between saving the school and not saving the school.
Or making a lot of mistakes in the process. We were just dealing with an endangered place that had gotten bids and had been told things by a local contractor. In this case, it was for a movie theater, an old historic movie theater they wanted to rehab. And the price estimate that they were getting was probably 50% too high, because this individual didn't have the background to really understand what was going to happen. And anyway, they would have been, had they gone that way, they would have run into one issue after another. And so enough said. Talk to somebody who really knows what they're doing.
Thank you. And Deborah, I hope that answers your questions. I'll give you a moment if you have any additional questions to type those in. And also I just wanted to say, too, on the grants, when your community is ready for those, you can always contact us at Heritage Ohio. We can put you in contact with those representatives that are in the region. Some of those organizations have statewide, some of those have regional representatives. So you can always find those on those respective websites, but we can always help you as well to direct you towards the right sources on those to get people to help you start those grant processes and come and take a look at those buildings once you get to that point.
One last comment, too. Sometimes when we start looking, understanding that there are sources of funding, whether it's tax credits or grants or just private developers who are going to combine credits with bank financing or other things, always what comes first is a plan. Nobody's going to give you grant money without a plan that holds water. So spending a little time, at least maybe not to the nth detail, but at least mapping out a concept, and it's always that's a really good first step.
Yes, that's a very good point to make with these, and I think that succinctly answered Debbie's question in Ashtabula. And I just wanted to say thank you once again to Peggy and Brandon for doing this, and to all of the people at the Historic Preservation League of Oregon. They took the time out of their day to do this for us here in Ohio, and thank you very much for partnering with us on this one. The presentation, the notes and so forth will be made available, and as Brandon said, you can always contact him. I'll send everyone his email address in case you didn't get it before. And once again, thank you guys for doing it today. It was a great presentation, and our next webinar will be coming up on March 21st, next Wednesday. So look for information on that this week. And do you guys have any last comments?
When there's a ribbon cutting out there, Peggy and I are both happy to be flown out and shake your guys' hand and give you a pat on the back and say good work.
Or at least send pictures. Hey, I grew up just to the north in Michigan, so my heart is with you.
Thank you, guys. And everyone, thanks for attending today, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much.